Yes, guys, what is going on? Welcome back to another episode of the Adapt Performance Podcast. In today's episode, we are joined by Steve Thompson. So Steve is a lecturer at Sheffield Hallam, and he was actually my first S&C lecturer, which he makes a joke in the podcast about my age, but I'm going to turn it back on him and say, what does this say about you that you basically taught me? So yeah, it's good. It's a really good episode. Just on that topic, is I can remember some of my first thoughts about Steve is that I am sure he used to live in the barbers, because every time I saw him, he had the freshest fade, he had it mid, it was really nice. So yeah, I think he used to go every lunchtime. He won't admit to that, but I'm pretty sure that's what he was doing. In terms of the episode, what we actually get into is velocity-based training. So very much it's a mixture actually. It's academic in a lot of ways. We do get into the science of it, but we also try and make it very specific to athletes. And you will be able to take away some solid points from today and apply this into your training, and ultimately just give you a little bit of an awareness of what VBT is. And how it potentially could be a little bit of a boost for you as an athlete. So yeah, really, really good episode. So go follow him, hit him up on his social media channels that he mentions at the end. So his Twitter mostly, but I do think he'll be putting out some more and more stuff over the coming months. So definitely get on that. What else has been going on? This at the time of recording, I'm a little bit backlogged actually. So you're going to kind of hear me speak through some of the same stuff. So this weekend we had a face-to-face meetup with some of our athletes that train with us at Adapt, which was absolutely sick. We got people from all over the UK meeting up and training, and it was just an awesome day. Just a really good environment, just a really good vibe. It was absolutely sick. This week we've got our performance nutritionist leading a Zoom workshop on hydration strategies, followed by a Q&A. So absolutely buzzing there. And just in general, the Adapt HQ is going strength to strength. Everybody's buzzing, everyone's achieving what they want to achieve. And yeah, it's one of those. Today's been a really nice day for me actually, just in terms of sitting back reflecting of what we're actually doing with Adapt. And it's a heart warmer. I'm not going to cry, but it is a good one. So yeah, really buzzing. But anyway, let's get into the episode. So this is me and Steve Thompson talking through velocity-based training. Cheers. Hiya Steve, how's it going, mate? Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jordan. I'm really good. Thank you for having me on.
Love it, mate. It was a no-brainer. Obviously, we caught up a little bit at the FFF, which is the Football Fit Federation.
That's the one.
Tongue twister. And obviously, I tried to get you on. Well, it must have been a year ago is when I first started.
Yeah. I remember you messaged and said you'd love to get me on and talk about VBT. So I think once we caught up the other week at that event, it just re-trigged in my mind that we needed to catch up and get on one of these. So I was happy to do it.
Love it. Right then, mate. I think let's start off with a little bit of an intro, mate. Just give us a quick whistle-stop tour of who you are, what you do, and that type of thing.
Okie doke. So yeah, I'm a senior lecturer currently based at Sheffield Hallam University. I'm also the course leader of our MSc in Strength and Conditioning Coaching. And within sort of my roles at Hallam, I do some coaching, some S&C coaching, do some consultancy, sort of active early career researcher, and about 12 months ago, successfully passed my PhD, which was specific on load velocity profile and prediction, which I'm sure we'll delve into at some point in this podcast, and then also do some kind of external coaching consultancy work typically within football. So a little bit at a local club, and then within the international setting as well. So keeping myself busy, but it's all really good stuff like we talked about before jumping on here. I can't complain with my job because I get to do some really cool and exciting things, and every day is very different, so it keeps me on my toes.
Love it. Research then. I'm curious, was this something that you always wanted to get into, or did you just kind of fall into it?
I think so. I always wanted to be a coach. From completing my masters, which I did at Hallam. When I completed my masters, there wasn't really any strength and conditioning masters at all. There might have been one or two in the country, but obviously compared to what it's like now, there's 30, 40 plus. all around the UK at different institutions. So the kind of the specified and a specific sort of S&C route that you can take now wasn't there, but it's an element that I could add into it. So but typically and sort of commonly, like most graduates, I was out of work for a while. I did an internship in Nottingham with a company called Sport 981. And then off the back of that, I think I had about 6 months out of work, and a job came up back at Hallam as a technician. Went for it, got it, did that for a few years, and then a job came up in lecturing that was in S&C, and as I mentioned, this was kind of the boom of S&C content and curriculum. Given some of my experience that I had and the fact that I kind of had my foot in the door anyway, I was successful in an interview to get that. And then things just sort of progressed. It was at the time of, there was kind of, lots of money in the universities at that time. And I was, luckily enough, offered a PhD. So I've been doing a little bit of research around VBT, and then just fell into research. Obviously being part of an academic institution, research is a big part of the role, and it's an aspiration of a lot of members of the different departments. And there's a little bit of an expectation, I think, in a good way, that if you're part of a team, of an academic team, you should be doing some research. So it was always something that I was interested in, not something that I planned to do, but something that certainly with my transition into academia became a lot more prominent, and I became a lot more interested in. And I really enjoy it now. It's really interesting to create research questions and build projects, and certainly when you get to work with some high-level athletes and organizations, it can be really cool.
That's sick, mate. That's sick. I was always really curious, actually. That was, I've always liked the idea of, signing a birthday card as, Dr. Jordan Webster, but I think it's the effort that would go into that. That'd be that's my main issue, is the actual work that it takes to get there. So I guess, mate, what I want to do is, just to intro this episode for people, is I want to pick your brains around VBT and how athletes can use it. So very much, kind of like an athlete's guide to velocity-based training, what it is, how it can benefit us, and then essentially what are the different ways we can get into it. So do you want to kick it off with, what is velocity-based training, I guess?
Yeah. So VBT, mentioned, stands for velocity-based training, and really encompasses anything that involves measurement and tracking of movement velocity. So typically in this space, we consider VBT something like barbell velocity. So we would then utilize some kind of technology, which is, potentially one of the drawbacks, because you do need technology to use VBT. But there's a whole host out there, and again, we'll delve into that at some point later on. But essentially, measuring any kind of velocity during some form of resistance constitutes as velocity-based training. You may have heard me say this before, but a bugbear of mine is the fact that often we hear even researchers and practitioners saying we are doing VBT, and I always question what that is, because I think VBT is a very broad term and a very broad approach to resistance training, and I think there's a lot of applications that sit under that umbrella term of VBT. But to keep it simple, velocity, we're doing some form.
Okay. And I guess with that then, well, this is actually really interesting. I was speaking to Lee Bell a couple of podcasts ago, and we were speaking through how, his research around deloading and overtraining. And in my mind, I'm sure other people fall into this as well, is me hearing that he does his research in deloads, I automatically assume, he is pro deloads. And I think actually it's the other way with him, depending on context and everything like that. So would you say that velocity-based training something that you do use with your athletes and you push to use because you believe it's, maybe, I'm going to say best practice, but it's a very valuable tool?
Yeah, I do. I really, I really kind of rate it, and I think it can be really, really impactful. What I don't like and is often is the fault of the academics as opposed to the coaches. And obviously I have both hats, so I can kind of say this. But the academics can make it very, very complex. And I'm sort of guilty of that with my PhD, because I think one of the most complex approaches to VBT, and sorry if we sort of jump around a little bit, but one of the most complex approaches is predicting 1RM. My whole PhD was on predicting 1RM, which I did for 5.5 years. And actually, since finishing, and the more I think about how that works in practice, I actually don't think it's really worth it, which is quite disappointing to say that I spent 5.5 years studying it. But I think it's still important that we can come to some form of conclusion. But I think there's definitely aspects of VBT which are a lot simpler that really should be utilised and probably aren't utilised enough.
Okay. So I guess pushing on from, the intro of velocity-based training then, so why is it important? Why does it matter?
So I always use a bit of an example, I suppose, and try and put some context when I get asked this question, and hopefully this will sort of make sense to any athletes that listen to the podcast and that listen to this episode. And I think if we take it really simply around going through an intervention, so at the start and at the end of intervention, we will always, or typically we should always do some form of performance testing, if nothing more to see if the intervention has worked. But we want to obviously get a snapshot as to where our athletes are, or where you are as an athlete at different points along the sort of the training journey. So if we take that example of we're doing a 6-week strength block, we do our typical 1RM at baseline, and then we do our retest at the end of that 6 weeks. If we are a good coach, or if we're an athlete that has a good coach, we expect that across that 6 weeks there will be some form of improvement if we've programmed well, and if we're training well, and if so long as no other factors impact that, such as injury or whatever. And in some sports, let's say strength sports like weightlifting, powerlifting, where their sport is to train in the gym, I think we can just about, if we're good coaches, we can get away with planning in appropriate progression to ensure that adaptation is sort of systematic and consistent across those 6 weeks. If we are any other athlete in any other sport where we've got a number of different confounding variables, and actually some of those confounding variables are relevant to strength sports as well. When we talk about sleep patterns, we talk about nutrition, we talk about external stressors, all those different kinds of things that we have to think about as athletes, they can all impact our ability to lift a given weight on a given day. And if, whether that's sub-max or max, if any of that drops, then essentially our 1RM will drop. And if you think about how we program, we'll take our baseline, we'll get our 1RM, and then we'll typically program sub-maximal intensities across the intervention, dependent on the physiological adaptation we want to try and elicit. Now, if we stick to those absolute loads, or those loads from our baseline testing, at some point along that intervention, even if everything goes swimmingly and we progress as we want to, those loads are going to become suboptimal. The likelihood is they're going to become too light, and the stimulus that we need to continue to adapt is going to be less than what it should be. But if we take the flip side of that, which I think is probably the more important side, of if we're an athlete who's working in a team sport, for example, where we've got technical training every day, we've got on-field stuff we need to do, we might have lots of travel, we might have lots of fixture congestions, all of these factors, in addition to our nutrition, our sleep, our psychology, etc., will all impact our ability to lift load, whatever that load may be. So really then we've got kind of a margin of error, or a window to which our daily strength can fluctuate up and down, and we need to be able to account for that. As a coach, it's our job and to do our due diligence to make sure that our athletes are training optimally all the time. But also as an athlete, it's our job to make sure that we're maximizing our physiological status, for want of a better term. And I think VBT can be really useful at doing that. And really all I'm describing there is auto-regulation. And auto-regulation is flexible programming. It's our ability to listen to what the body's telling us, listen to our neuromuscular systems, listen to our physiological status, listen to our psychological status, if you want to kind of delve into some of John Kiley's work around how stresses and external stresses can impact our strength levels on a regular basis. Auto-regulation accounts for that. And by accounting for that, we can make sure the load on the bar or the load that we run outside or whatever, the volume that we do, matches how we feel on that given day. And also make sure that the recovery we then need to implement is appropriate. And I suppose links a little bit to kind of the deload stuff that you'll chat about with Lee. Mm-hmm. But from conversations I've had with Lee about deload, auto-regulation is the best way of doing it, because we're not just planning in deloads for no reason. We're listening to what the body's telling us. And I think that's a really important part of coaching that can often get overlooked.
Love it. Yeah, and I think as you were kind of talking through, that example there, I was thinking back to my training years ago, and I was like a 5'5" guy. Love it. Absolutely get on 5'5". And, a typical, percentage for that is about 80%, let's say. Mm-hmm. And that was how I would program. I'd do 5'5", 80%. I'd probably do that for 1, potentially 2 weeks. And then I'd add a few percent, 1 or 2%. And I'd keep going until essentially I couldn't do it anymore. Yeah. And I can remember, this particular program, I was probably like 4 weeks in, and I absolutely smoked the weight. I just killed it. Like 5'5", it just felt pathetically easy. Okay. And I was like, right, next week I'll put it up. And I failed the first set, and it was one of those where I was like, what has gone on? Have I got weaker in a week? Did I just misjudge it? Did I misload the bar? All sorts goes through your head. Yeah. So essentially what you're saying there with the auto-regulation thing is seeing where you are on that given day, and then essentially just meeting Jordan where he's at on that day to elicit the strength response. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, 100%. And that then becomes for me, that then becomes your main programming tool. Like I always describe two aspects of programming. So you've got your flexible stuff, which is what we've just described, your auto-regulation. And then you've got your non-flexible stuff, which is your typical percentage of 1RM, RM targets, kind of a bit more around periodization and how that looks longer term. And I think to have the two is important, because you need the blueprint stuff, and then you need the flexibility of the flexible auto-regulation. But really, once you've written that blueprint, all then becomes about the auto-reg. It all then becomes about how close are we to that blueprint, how close are we to that plan. But if we're miles away, as long as the strategies we've got in place from a flexible programming perspective are, then trust what that's telling you, trust what your body's saying to you. And if it's saying you can't do this today, then don't do it. And I think it's important for athletes to recognize that, because I suppose, not to sort of stereotype athletes, but you probably get two types. You get those that perhaps don't like to work that hard and will get away with doing the bare minimum. And then you get those that will constantly push themselves to a point where actually it becomes negative or it becomes dangerous. And for both of those groups, auto-regulation can be really impactful. For the latter, it can bring them back and make sure that they're not going to overreach and overtrain if that was a worry. And for the former group, it can actually just educate them on what they can do, and make them a little bit more accountable as to what they can and should be doing on a more regular basis.
So I can remember seeing some research, and you'll probably know who this is, but when he speaks about daily strength measures adjusting by, is it 36% total or 18% either way?
I think it's 18%, and it's plus or minus 18%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can remember thinking, I've definitely had ones where I felt 18% weaker or however much percent weaker. I haven't had much the other way. Yeah. And that kind of goes a little bit more into the whole lifestyle factor. Is that what you'd kind of deem that to? Just like your sleep, your nutrition, hydration. Is that kind of the thinking?
I think so, yeah. I think I mean, I know which paper you're referring to, and I think the difficulty with stuff like this is often it's done based on predictions. So that particular paper was done on 1RM predictions across a span of, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks, where they did sets to failure and then predicted 1RM off the back of it. I think that was the protocol. Now, there's obvious issues with prediction. There's always going to be error in that prediction, but I think as long as it's not too much, you get a feel for the fluctuations that might occur. And you know, it just, for me, is common sense that if you're an athlete who has a very busy schedule, that has lots of physical training, there's just no way you can lift the same loads every single day, or just constantly get or improve, given all those other stresses that your body's got to deal with. It has to decompress at some time. And you know, there isn't an awful lot of research around that fluctuation. I think because, you know, asking someone to do 1RMs consecutively for a period of time is actually, it's not practical. It's not realistic in terms of what would happen. And then you get some of the ethical issues around actually asking someone to do that on a regular basis. So the research is difficult to do, but you know, I think if you've been in coaching long enough, you will have enough anecdotal evidence to show that is going to be the case. And therefore, I think it's something that needs to be considered as much as we possibly can.
Got you. Okay, so I guess if we'll take 2 examples, Steve, if that's all right. So let's say I'm an athlete who you're going to be working with, and my main goals for now is going to be around actually just gaining strength. Okay, so that's something that I want to do. What would be your approach from, you know, using VBT as a tool to potentially get me to where I need to be? What would that look like?
Okay, so there's lots of routes you could take, and I think often those routes are dictated by your environment. So one of the questions I get a lot around VBT is what's best practice, and my default political answer is best practice is whatever fits your environment. So if you're an organization that has lots and lots of money, has lots of time to work one-on-one with athletes and maybe do so 3 or 4 times a week, then your best practice is doing lots and lots of VBT, a real immersive program in VBT. If you're an athlete that works on their own and only has the opportunity to train twice a week and has to make do with an iPhone application, then your best practice is going to be sort of the other end of the spectrum, where maybe you're doing 1 or 2 very simple VBT approaches that'll still help progress your program a little bit. So I think it's always important to kind of consider what's feasible and what's not. There's no point in doing something that isn't going to work. But I think if let's take the best case scenario of, you know, lots of money, lots of time, lots of access, then for somebody that's looking to just develop strength, there's a few things that I would do. First thing is I would profile. So I would do a load velocity profile in a key exercise or in a few key exercises. So some of the considerations around profiling is that every exercise has a separate profile. So it's not like you could do 1 on a back squat and then that would transfer to bench press, deadlift, trap bar, jumps, etc., etc. So pick the key exercises, and those exercises that are going to be consistent across the full program. You know, block after block, you're still going to have them. Once you've done your profile, I would then be utilizing that information to auto-regulate your loading. So the easiest way to describe that and the easiest way to implement that would be essentially you would utilize a predictive equation. So if it's lower body exercise, I would be going for a second order polynomial predictive equation or a quadratic equation. If you're doing upper body, I would still go for that. But if you want to use linear, you can, because I think that an upper body exercise has a much more of a linear trend than a lower body would. When you utilize that predictive equation, you essentially then input the X value, which in this instance would be the load that you want to lift, And you essentially solve that equation by implementing, let's say you want to do 80%, you'll have your predictive equation. So if it's linear, it would be y equals ax plus b. You input the x into that equation, and that would then work out the y, which is going to be your velocity. Okay, so if you want to work at 80% velocity, if you picture a graph and a straight line, you go up from the x and then across to the y. And essentially that's how the equation works it out. So the a and the b is your slope. So the angle of the line and where it crosses the intercept. And that's important information for that equation to figure out and solve y. So essentially, you figure out where that velocity is, and that is then the velocity that you should be working at if you're going to work at that particular relative load. Now, obviously, to provide some context with that, let's say your 80% 1RM is 100 kilograms and you lift that at 0.5 meters per second. Every rep isn't going to be 0.5 meters per second because there's error in human movement and there's error in technology. So what I would be doing then is I would be providing a bit of a kind of a window, so a plus or minus meters per second. And with that in, I would maybe go from 0.47 to 0.53 to give you a window of around 0.06, which some of the research suggests is a kind of smallest detectable difference. And that's where I would look to spend all my time when lifting that particular exercise at that particular load. Now, the way in which you practically then make that work is you do your warm-up sets, you get as close to that 0.47 to 0.53, or you get in it, and then every set, you kind of just sort of crudely auto-reg the amount of load on the bar. So if it's 100 for today, and then you suddenly start lifting that at 0.56, 0.58, I'd be making that 105, maybe 110 until that velocity dropped back into that zone. The next session or the next set, if it drops out, you just do a little bit of manipulation and it stays within that zone. And the theory behind that is you are then auto-regulating and you're making sure that the load is optimal for the exact physiological adaptation that you want to try and elicit. And if that's strength, then perhaps that's going to be a heavier load, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of dealing with the intensity part of the equation, if you will. And then the other thing to consider is the volume. And one of the ways we can look at manipulating volume is based on a velocity loss. Velocity loss is essentially what dictates the stopping of a set. So instead of, as you mentioned, doing the classic 5x5, you would say, right, well, I'm going to work at 8% today, and we've figured out what that looks like from a VBT perspective. And I'm also going to do 5 sets, but the reps are going to be dictated by velocity loss. So you might say for a strength, to develop strength, you might want a 20% velocity loss. So what you would do is you'd start your set. All the sort of the good technologies out there can do this for you. You start your set, and essentially when the velocity of that rep, the last rep drops below 20%, you'll hear a nasty dong or some kind of red thing will come up on the screen, and that's telling you to then stop the set. And essentially what that's doing is individualizing the volume as well as the intensity, because what you just described there a moment ago around the 5x5 at 80%, that is one of the classics, and it's what everybody does. And yet 5x5 at 80% for you is going to look very different to 5x5 at 80% for me. And I think, one of the most important principles we're taught in first year at university, or even probably earlier than that at BTECs, the sports science BTECs or whatever, is individualization. And we're really good as an industry, we're really good at individualizing intensity, but I just don't really feel like we're that good at individualizing volume. We just still stick at this 5x5 or 6x3 or 3x10 or whatever it is. And yet everybody's 3x10 is going to be different. Everybody's going to do different loads, or at different loads, everybody's going to be able to do different sort of rep ranges. So why not utilize the same technology and auto-regulate the volume at the same time? So they're kind of...
I think an important part...
Sorry, go on.
An important part on that, Steve, as well, is I think I sound dead self-centered with this, but I'm thinking back to my training with it, and you speaking through, your volume might be different to my volume, whereas my volume at the minute compared to 5-6 years ago is totally different. Like
Exactly.
I used to be able to just plow through it. I would say, I guess I was just more well trained. I don't know, but over the last 5 years, I'm doing a little bit less. It just, I can't seem to tolerate it as much. Like I am limping after a standard session that I'd usually be able to manage. I suppose that's an important, aspect as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably age is probably a factor there, Jordan. I hate to say.
How dare you? How dare you?
It happened. It started happening to me as well. And I think that's the only logical explanation I've got is I'm just getting a bit old.
It's out of our control, mate.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. You've got yourself to compare to as well, and you're never going to be able to do what you used to be able to do, and what you do in the future is going to look different to what you can do now. So being able to auto-regulate everything, is ideal. It's the optimum strategy for getting stronger or getting faster or whatever the goal might be. And it's just the methods in which we use to achieve that, I suppose, is the complexity. But you're right. Yeah, the kind of self-competition and self change and adaptation is an important factor as well.
Nice. Okay, so I think whilst we're on the topic of strength then, and that was kind of, got your gold standard, your perfect environment situation. You mentioned around apps and, very usable technology out there. If you only had an app, and let's say you're working more on your own or online or whatever, is that still possible, or would the strategy and your expectations of how VBT can help you change a little bit?
No, it's absolutely still. I mean, for me, the smartphone applications, they're the future. They're the exciting things in any kind of technology, really. The stuff you can do with smartphone apps these days is ridiculous, and it's only going to get better. So I think, there's a couple of apps out there that are really, really good apps that I think have good data behind them, have good developers behind them, and are quite intuitive in the way that you use them. So one of those is Metric VBT, developed by a guy called Jacob Taucher, based out in Australia. They're relatively new, but certainly making some waves in sort of this space. And then the other app is MyLift, which is part of the MyJump lab from Carlos Balsalobra. And again, certainly validated as an application in terms of the data that it gives you. And all of those, both of those apps, you can do everything that I just described. You can do velocity loss, you can do profiling, you can look at auto-regulating based on live feedback. So just because it's not a shiny box with a tether coming out of it, or it's not a fancy accelerometer that kind of does lots of different stuff, doesn't mean you can't do VBT and you can't implement those different applications to a really, really successful standard.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, that's perfect. So I guess let's move on to, let's say me as the athlete, my goals are different. It's more about speed and getting more powerful. Is the application the same, or does it change?
Yeah, for me, it's pretty much the same. Like over the years, I've done a lot of research around VBT, and I've been to a number of workshops, listened to a load of experts talk about it and stuff, and I think often it's tried to be separated, but really the strategy and the underpinning principles are exactly the same. It's just where you sit on that force velocity or load velocity spectrum as to the adaptation that we're trying to elicit, essentially. So from a velocity loss perspective, yes, we can still implement the same strategy if we're looking at developing power or impulse or whatever term you want to use. We're probably looking at the lower end of that velocity loss. So we might be looking at 5-10% because, again, common sense really, but the more volume we produce, the slower we produce that volume, or the slower that work that's done. And therefore, the more metabolic adaptations we're going to elicit, the more muscular, morphological adaptations we're going to elicit. whereas the less the volume, the higher the intensity can be, likelihood the lower the weight might be if we're talking about sort of power training or explosive training, and therefore we're going to be targeting slightly different physiological mechanisms, but the principle's still the same. We're still going to profile. We might profile in different exercises, for example. So instead of doing a back squat, we might do a squat jump. Instead of doing a bench press, we might do a bench throw, because we know that those exercises lend themselves to be more explosive. There's a larger accelerated phase, which means we can produce a higher mechanical output based on sort of the force velocity relationship again. But we're still going to profile. We're still going to then auto-regulate that load based on how we feel on that given day, and we're still going to implement some form of velocity loss. And even sort of the type of velocity you might use. Typically, the recommendation is mean velocity for strength, peak velocity for power. I disagree. I think mean velocity for everything. Maybe mean propulsive velocity. Peak velocity, from my understanding and my research and the data that I've collected, is far too variable for us to collect reliable data. It's just a snapshot. And if we're using, if we're looking at using technology that has quite a high sampling rate, it could be a snapshot over 0.02 seconds. And does that tell us a lot? I don't know. Maybe it does to some degree, but I certainly wouldn't be comfortable making programming decisions based on such a small time point. So from my perspective, use mean velocity. It's simple, and it crosses over any type of exercise. So yeah, I think process is the same, just slight tweaks there really in terms of exercise, velocity loss, and maybe the intensity that we look to work at.
Got you. So just thinking through some of the velocity loss stuff there then. So if we had to kind of put a rough percentage to this for like different adaptations, and obviously it is a little bit of a spectrum, and there's individual differences in how we might approach it. Yeah. What are we saying, like roughly 5 to 10% for power?
Yeah, 5 to 10% for power, sort of 15 to 25% for strength, and then 30 to you're not going to get much more than 40% really, because by that point you're pretty close to failure. But yeah, 30 to 45% is going to be your hypertrophy type morphological adaptations as a real sort of generalized window of how you might work. Again, we can individualize that as much as we possibly can, and we want to try and do that, look at individual responses to different velocity loss thresholds. But I think we can be more confident in those general zones in terms of the physiological adaptations than we could be around on sort of thinking of the intensity side of the argument.
Nice. Okay, that's really useful to have. So I think I want to take a few, steps back actually into load velocity profiling and how that kind of looks. Maybe use a back squat example. Okay. I've got the app. I'm ready to go. You said to do it. How do I do it? Okay,
cool. So again, low velocity profile can be really simple. And the easiest way to describe it is it's a 1RM. It's undertaking a 1RM. The only difference is you might do a few more increments, and those lighter increments, we still have to move at maximal intent. So maximizing the velocity that we possibly can and the intent. But essentially, it's an incremental protocol that typically would culminate in a 1RM. So there's no real difference, which, again, there's criticisms around low velocity profiling in terms of, it takes too long and all these different factors. But if you can do a 1RM, and that's a staple test in your sort of battery, then you can do a low velocity profile. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. So yeah, you pick your exercise, back squat, and then you plan your protocol. Now, you could do a protocol that starts at body weight and goes up by 5% all the way up to 100. Now, that's going to be very, very immersive. That's going to take a long time. But if you've got that you can afford the time to do that, then by all means. You might do 10% increments, you might do 20% increments, you might do it more as a sort of more of a fixed load in terms of absolute load instead of relative. So you might say, well, I'm going to do 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, and that's going to be the start of my profile. Or if you're a really strong individual, you might start at 50 and go up by 20 or 30 if you're squatting upwards of 200, for example. And then all you do is you measure the velocity of every single repetition within that protocol. So if it was me, anything below 50% 1RM, I'd be looking at doing 3 to 5 reps. From 50 to sort of 75, 80%, I'd be looking at doing 2 reps. And then anything above 80%, I'd just do 1 rep. The reason I think we slightly amend those repetition ranges is typically the lighter loads are just a little bit more variable. So you need a little bit more time and a little bit more confidence in the data that you're collecting at those lighter loads. We know that when we get past 80%, if we're lifting 1 repetition, it's going to be relatively heavy, so we're going to have to put in maximal effort, and I think we're comfortable that one velocity is going to be pretty reliable. So once you've then collected that data, that's your profile, and you can use that information however you want, as I've just described, or you can then start to delve into kind of that's something that you felt was important. But again, the protocol can be really simple, and you can actually go. You could go as few as three loads or even 2 loads. The reason I wouldn't typically do 2 loads for a back squat is because that then means you would have to use a linear regression. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't personally think, and my research backs this up and other research backs this up, that a lower body exercise in a free weight, using free weight equipment, is a linear profile, a linear trend. I think it's a curvilinear. So you would have to at minimum do 3 loads in order to apply then that second order polynomial or that quadratic. But if time isn't something you have a lot of, then there's no reason why you couldn't do 3 or 4 loads and still get a relatively reliable and consistent profile.
Love it. Okay. So I guess if we were going to do 3 or 4, and I guess it depends on time, but if we're trying to almost integrate this into, a training session where it's, not very disruptive to what your programming looks like, what would you say? Like, I'm trying to think, if we say we're 100 kilo back squat, that's your 1 rep max.
Yep.
Is it like a 40 kilo, 60 kilo, and 80 kilo? Would that be enough for you to have like a really good snapshot of their profile?
Yeah, I'd maybe go a little bit lighter than 40 to start with. So you might do, I don't know, 25, 50, 75, 100, something like that. I mean, with a profile, there's nothing to say that you have to go up to 1RM. So we can always, again, there's 3 strategies we can use to finish off that profile to get that 1RM figure, if that's desirable for us. So using that example of 100K back squatter, you could do 25, 50, 75, and they're the 3 loads that you lift. If you then want to try and get your actual 1RM, you'd then go up to 100, and you would maybe do 2 or 3 sets around that 100 to get it, get a true reflection of your 1RM. It might be 105, it might be 97.5, whatever. Or you could stop at 75 and you could then take some data from the literature. So there's lots of research out there on back squat, free weight back squat. You could say, which is a real sort of ballpark figure, you're looking at around 0.25 meters per second for 1RM. You could essentially just extrapolate down to that and say, well, that's going to be my reference point. And that's where I think my 1RM is going to be, because I kind of fit the fix of those used in that research project. So I'm going to say that that's me. If you haven't got the time and the desire to actually lift that 1RM load. The other option would be to do a set to failure and perform those sets to failure and take the last repetition of that set to failure, which in theory is similar to where your 1RM velocity would be. Now, there are a few caveats with that, in the sense of you don't want to do too high a rep range of that set to failure, because the lighter the load, the kind of the more variation you get in the sort of agreement between last rep and 1RM velocities. So I'd be looking to do a 3 or a 5 RM max, nothing more than a 5 RM, and taking that last rep velocity and then putting that into the equation and using that as your extrapolation point to figure out what your 1 RM would actually be. So there's 3 methods, but I think, yeah, you can, when looking to do sort of minimal loads, I try and span sort of the load continuum as much as you possibly can. So I often start at 0 load. I would often start at 0 and then do 0, 30, 60, 90, for example. But yeah, whatever fits your environment, really, I think, and the time, and whether it's yourself doing it or whether you're doing it for an athlete, you just figure out what fits your environment best, really.
With doing a set to failure to get a really good measure of the minimal velocity threshold, the higher reps, is that it doesn't correlate as well? Is that because of like metabolite buildup? Is that essentially what it is? It just doesn't correlate to how, like a fresh strength level? Is that what it is?
I don't know. Physiologically, I'm not sure. I think practically from when I've seen it been done or when I've done it myself, I think because it's a lighter load, you're able to maintain. So what you would want to see from a set to failure is almost like, a drop off. So each repetition gets that little bit slower until you fail. When you're doing sets of 10, 15, whatever it might be, or loads of 60, 70, even 80%, you find that the kind of the drop off is a lot less severe until you get to your final rep, and it still might be quite quick, but then you're just done. You're failed. It's just flawed. Yeah. So I've implemented research where I've had someone doing I think it was a 50% 1RM set to failure, and I had CrossFit athletes going into 40 odd reps, and then the velocities were so consistent, and then all of a sudden they just done. I think one person almost passed out, actually. But, you know what CrossFitters are like. So I think it's just the ability to, I suppose it probably links to your muscle typology. So if you have a lot of type 1, you can probably just constantly drive those reps out at a given intensity until those type 1 and all your type 2 then just, right, I'm done, can't do anymore, and then you just stop. Whereas 90 to 95% 1RM is all type 2, it's all neural. There's no real metabolic there will be metabolic sort of mechanisms being stimulated, but we're sort of targeting those neural mechanisms. So I think the drop off is a lot more severe, and therefore gives us a truer reflection of what our velocity at 1RM would be.
Love it. It's interesting. I was thinking back to when I was using this a little bit more, when I was more at Hallam, and there's going to be a question that comes off the back of this, is I'm quite a grindy lifter, like it doesn't matter if it's a 20 kilo bar or 150 on the bar. I'm just slow. I've got nothing. But I can remember my minimal velocity threshold mean was around, I got to 0.13. So it was grindy as shit. Like it was slow. Yeah. And I then wondered, does that change? Like, is that something that does change over a lifetime? So if I was a sprinter back in the day, but I started doing more of your slower velocity based off your classic powerlifting, can that get lower and lower?
Yeah.
Or is it pretty stagnant?
I would say, no, I think it has to. I think it all relates back to the SAID principle, doesn't it? And it's kind of like, if you start training in a certain way, your physiology is going to adapt to that particular way, which means your mechanical output is going to adapt to that particular way, because they're directly linked. So if your muscle typology changes to be more type 1 or type 2, then the velocities and the force outputs that you can produce are going to link to that, because they have to. So I think it definitely changes. I think one of the important factors of VBT is that over sort of a short to medium term, it doesn't change. And what I mean by that is the velocity at relative loads stays pretty much consistent over a decent amount of time. Obviously, if you get stronger, your absolute load at those relative loads will change, and therefore the velocities at those absolute loads will change. But we need the velocity and the relative loads to stay. If they don't, we're then doing these auto-regulatory practices based off something that is fluctuating itself. And you just multiplying the amount of error and the possibility that you're not going to be working as optimally as you possibly could be. But today, the research that's out there suggests that it is pretty stable, but that's only, I think, or 10 weeks. So we need to know what happens over a longer term period, because if it changes after 6 months, well, we need to know that to then make sure that we're doing profiles at appropriate intervals to then readjust those loads and those velocities at the different intensities.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's I just thought of that then. It's not something I've really kind of considered before, but I guess in the same way that, heart rate changes and your ability to push, I thought it was okay, cool.
Yeah.
So one final question then, and I guess because I haven't really used Metric or MyLift or any of the apps that are currently out there at the moment. So working a little bit more in the online space, I'm thinking about ways that I can use this. And back in the day with some of the rugby lads at Hallam, we were doing, we were using the gym aware, and we were using, we just picked a load, I think it was like 30 kilo, so 20 kilo plus the bar. Yeah. And the objective was to jump with it. And we wanted people to get the highest. I think we did use peak back then.
Yeah.
And the objective was, it was a little bit of competition. Let's go, let's get rowdy.
Yeah.
Do is that something you feel like we could integrate in an easy-ish way with Metric or MyLift, to create a little bit of competition with my online guys? Because we've got some American football, we've got rugby. Is it going to be faffy, or do you think that actually is, on the cards?
I think so. I mean, my understanding, and don't quote me on this, but my understanding is that most of the technologies these days have leaderboards, and therefore, if you have a leaderboard, and if that leaderboard can be accessed remotely by people either training at the same time or just plug into it, then that's such a healthy way of creating some intent. So I suppose one of the things I've not really mentioned in this podcast is the power of feedback. So VBT is essentially a kind of a method of sort of biofeedback. So we can drive intent, we can create motivation, we can create healthy competition, either with oneself or with individuals of the same squad in the same session, or like you describe, maybe all around the world. And actually it can be really positive in creating and driving intent. So when I mentioned, right at the start around those athletes that perhaps, want to do the bare minimum, I think feedback is a really good way of moving them out of that comfort zone and getting them to push a little bit more. And one of the things that I found works really well is, certainly in settings that I'm working a lot, which is, typically football, is to take away the importance of the load and make it all about the speed or the velocity. And that can have a really positive outcome, because we all know that football players, rugby players, any player really, that they want to be fast. That's a big, important aspect of being successful in their sport. So if we can take that fast mentality that we try and implement outside, move that into the gym, then actually we can, again, create some real healthy intent and competition. We can get leaderboards up, and we can get people moving in a way that in our heads looks a bit more like we'd like them, we want them to move. So my understanding of those two applications, that is possible. There's no reason why it wouldn't work. And I think as long as everybody buys into it, everybody is willing to move whatever load you determine with max intent, everyone's willing to obviously abide by whatever rules you put in place around technique and around this, that, and the other, then it can be so positive, and it can be such an important way of getting the best out of athletes and really getting them to not only buy into your program, because that's a really important part as a coach. They have to buy into your program, but also then accelerating their adaptations and their progression through gym work and strength work.
Love it. I feel like that's a really nice point to finish on.
Cool.
So, I say that, and now I'm going to spit you 2 questions straight away. So, where can people find out more about you and the stuff that you're putting out? And the second one is, where can people go to essentially upskill a little bit in VBT if you've kind of given them some curiosity to delve a little bit deeper?
Okay. So myself, typically only use Twitter. So my handle is Steve381. So, find me, follow me, get in touch. I'm always happy to chat about VBT. It's kind of is a bit of a passion of mine, and it's something that I've spent a lot of time reading about and researching and applying in a sort of practical context. So I'm always happy to chat to people about it. I suppose my research specifically, just find me on ResearchGate or on LinkedIn or something like that, and the stuff's up there. And then in terms of specific VBT content, there's a few people out there that put some good stuff out. So Output are doing some good stuff in the VBT sphere. So they've got some good blog posts and some good guest speakers and webinars. I was actually on one a few weeks ago with Chris Toombs. There's obviously people like Dan Baker, Jonathan Weekly, who have done a lot in this space, either research or kind of workshops and that kind of thing. So have a look at some of their stuff, and then just get on sort of social media really, and see what people are putting out there. It's it's such a rich database of information these days, Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and all the other ones. So I think if you search for the right things, and there's plenty of good stuff out there that you can start to have a look at. But like I said, I'm always happy to chat to people. I'm very open and very happy to provide advice and guidance to different athletes or coaches or organizations around how they can best implement VBT and hopefully make it specific to their environment, and not just say, well, here's what the textbooks say you should do. I like to try and troubleshoot for people as well. So yeah, just get in touch.
Sick. Mate, I think what you said there actually is a really good point, that social media can be a really rich database. And if if your feed isn't full of velocity-based training stuff, just type in velocity-based training on hashtags and you'll find so much. Like I've quite a few warm-up games that I use with people, and I literally just typed in warm-up games and you'll just see all, and it's perfect, mate. And you just copy every single one of them.
Absolutely.
But yeah, in terms of all your information, mate, I'll put that in the show notes below, and then I'll write down a few of the names and probably just put a few websites for people to delve straight into, Output, Dan Baker, that type of thing as well. But yeah,
Perfect.
Just want to thank you for your time, mate. That was absolutely sick, and I know that's going to be really valuable for a lot of people.
Pleasure, Jordan. Thanks for having me on. It's been really fun.
Cheers, mate.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Adapt Performance podcast. Let me know what you thought about the episode by leaving a review or sending me a direct message. I'm all for receiving the honest feedback to make sure the episodes grow and get better and better. Like, share, subscribing and following all goes a long way to making sure the podcast reaches the right people. Thanks a lot. Catch you next time.